Hello, everyone. Let me start with a simple but uncomfortable question. What happens to Europe when the United States stops being its automatic safety net? For decades, nobody in Washington or Brussels seriously asked this. But over the past several months, it has stopped being a theoretical question. It has become real, and both sides of the Atlantic feel it. For most of the modern era, the idea was straightforward. America guarantees Europe's security. America sets the direction. America decides when NATO acts. And Europe builds its defense policies around that certainty. But now something very different is happening. The United States is openly debating whether it should continue carrying this responsibility. Officials say Europe needs to take care of itself. And across the political spectrum, more voices argue that the U.S. must prioritize competition with China and reduce its role in Europe. This debate is not new. What is new is Europe's reaction. For the first time in decades, European leaders are publicly discussing a future where the United States is no longer the core of their security system. Tonight, we will unpack what that shift means for Europe, for NATO, and for America's own strategic future. Let's start with the American debate. In Washington, the questions are becoming sharper. Why should American taxpayers finance the defense of countries richer than many U.S. states? Why remain deeply engaged in Europe when China is clearly the long-term challenge? And is America still prepared to be the first responder every time Europe faces a crisis? Voices in both parties now argue that America must redefine its global role. They disagree on the details, but Europe hears one thing clearly. The old guarantees are no longer automatic. This is not hostility. It is strategic recalibration. But the implications for Europe are dramatic. Because the moment America even discusses stepping back, Europe has to confront the question it avoided for 70 years. Can it defend itself without U.S. leadership? For decades, the answer was simple. No, and Europe did not need to. Washington provided the nuclear umbrella, the intelligence networks, the command structure, and most of NATO's military power. Europe contributed, but always knowing that if something serious happened, the United States would show up. That model worked because two assumptions held. America saw Europe as a priority, and Europe trusted America completely. Both assumptions are now fading. That is why European leaders are suddenly talking openly about a world where they can no longer rely on Washington the way they used to. And that is why debates that once sounded impossible are now happening everywhere in Europe. A shared defense budget, joint air and missile defense systems independent of the U.S., new security pacts built around Poland, the Baltics, the UK, and Northern Europe, and a long-term security role for Ukraine. These are not theoretical discussions anymore. These are early steps toward reshaping Europe's entire defense architecture. And this is where Ukraine becomes central. In Washington, Ukraine is often discussed in terms of aid, domestic politics, or the U.S. Russia rivalry. But in Europe, Ukraine is turning into something else entirely, the eastern anchor of any future European security system. Ukraine today has the largest land army in Europe, real combat experience against Russia, and a frontline position that defines the continent's security landscape. Whether it joins NATO or not, European planners now treat Ukraine not as an optional partner, but as a structural necessity. And for the United States, this is important. It shows that Europe is beginning to rethink security not as something America should manage forever, but as something Europe must start building for itself. Now, what about NATO? Many people assume NATO's future is binary, strong or collapsing. But the more realistic scenario is something in between. NATO will survive. It is too large and too integrated to disappear, but its meaning may change. If the United States steps back from automatic leadership, NATO becomes less of a military shield and more of a political coordination platform, a place for diplomacy, standards, and discussions. But not the same collective defense mechanism built around American power. For the U.S., this brings both risks and opportunities. Influence in Europe could shrink, but the burden on America's defense budget would decrease, and Europe would be forced to take responsibility for its own security. And that leads to the real question. Is Europe ready for that responsibility? Right now, Europe stands at a strategic crossroads. There are only two paths ahead. Path 1. Dependence with uncertainty. Europe continues relying on the United States, hoping American politics stabilize and commitments hold. But hope is not a strategy, especially when political winds shift so quickly. Path 2. Building a new European security architecture. Europe develops a multi-layered defense system, with France and Germany as political anchors, the UK, Poland, the Baltics, and Northern Europe as military drivers, and Ukraine as the Eastern Pillar. This path is expensive and complex, but it is the only one that gives Europe real strategic control. And for the United States, a stronger Europe is not a threat. It is an asset, a partner that can defend itself and allows America to focus on priorities like the Indo-Pacific and technological competition. Here is the essential point for American viewers. This debate is not about generosity. It is not about saving Europe. It is about strategy. The United States faces simultaneous challenges in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. The real question is whether the current system, where Washington carries most of the burden, is sustainable. A Europe that takes responsibility helps America focus on what matters most. A Europe that refuses to adapt leaves the U.S. with the worst of both worlds, an ally dependent on American protection, but increasingly unsure of American reliability. And that is why this conversation matters, for Europe and for America's long-term strategic future. Let me end with this. The world is moving away from automatic alliances. Europe is redefining its security. The United States is redefining its role. And Ukraine has unexpectedly become one of the central players in this transformation. So the real question now is not only about Europe. It is about America as well. Does the United States want partners who can stand on their own? Or does it want to keep carrying a system that no longer reflects political reality? Europe will eventually choose its path, but America must choose its own. And the choices both sides make will shape the global balance of power for the next generation. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, and see you in the next video. This was Vali Alabayov, political analyst from Baku.